Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. I'm going to cover a lot of questions that I've gotten from viewers recently regarding line selection. I get questions all of the time where people want to know what line I use for different techniques, different baits on bait casting gear, spinning gear. So I'm going to go over all of that today. But I want to throw out that just because that these are the line selections that I use, you should stick with what you're most comfortable with, what you have the most confidence in. Over the years, I feel like I've used almost every line that's out there for almost every different technique. And it's just one of those things that sometimes I do things that are against the book because it's what I'm comfortable with. And you have to recognize as well that your line selection also needs to go in line with what specific rod you're using, meaning some people prefer to use a lighter action rod or a slower speed rod and throw it on braided line. If they're fishing, say, I don't know, a chatterbait. Whereas I would rather throw maybe a stiffer rod with fluorocarbon line with a chatterbait, and you're almost getting the same sort of reaction and efficiency out of your bait because in one case your braided line is got less stretch than say your fluorocarbon. But if you're using a softer rod, that softer rod is allowing there to be more bend in your rod, which acts almost as stretch in your line, versus a faster action rod, which has less bend in the rod, and therefore it takes away some of that stretch. So you need to recognize that line choice is very important, but it also needs to be paired up with the right rod. So if you're throwing braided line and an extra fast action rod, you've got like the least amount of stretch and softness available at all. And you're probably going to rip some baits out of fish's mouth. Just something to be aware of. But at the same time, if you throw a moderate action rod that's paired up with monofilament and you're using maybe even a fiberglass rod, it's going to be like a yo-yo and you're going to have a hard time getting the hooks driven home and the hooks in the fish's mouth. So it's something to be aware of. It's not just about line selection, um, but the questions are always about line selection. So that's what I'll get into. Before I do, I want to remind you guys that if you're looking for additional content from me, check out my members only page. A bunch of extra videos, monthly live streams, direct access to me can all be had through the members only page. At the same time, if you want to support the channel, guys, I'd appreciate it if you do your tackle shopping using my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link, which I'll provide in the video description. It's a great way to support the channel and very, very much appreciated. It helps me fund doing all of these videos and putting out the content for you guys. So thank you very much to those of you who have been using that. And all right, so let's get into today's topic. So these questions are usually geared towards, what do I use for a specific technique from a line perspective. So I'm just going to go through each of the what I consider the three main line categories. You've got your braided line, your fluorocarbon line, and monofilament. I don't personally use any of the blended lines. I'm not a big fan of like the copolymers. I just feel like I'd rather go with one of those three main ones. Those are the ones that I'm most comfortable with. So we're going to start off with braid. Braid to me, I can almost break it up into two categories. Most braided lines out there now are either going to be a high strand count braid or a low strand, meaning, for example, Berkeley, the ones that I use are Berkeley X9 and X5. As the name states, X9 is 9 strands woven together, X5 is 5 strands woven together. And they have different characteristics, but the biggest thing you want to recognize is the more strands in your braided line, the smoother the braided line will be as a whole, which generally means better casting length, uh, but it doesn't have the same sawing characteristics that cut through, say, grass is good, but it won't cut into wood as much if it's got 9 woven strands versus 5. If you have 5 strands, what that means is you've got less strands woven together, so it's much kind of more rope-like, I guess is what I would say, and therefore that has more cutting characteristics. So those are the big differences with braid for me. So now having said that, when I'm throwing spinning rods, the most of my spinning gear, I have a braid backing on. And I almost always go with a Berkeley X9. So a high number strand braided line because that's much silkier, it's much smoother on the casting, and I'm not using my spinning gear in heavier cover. So I would rather have that smoother braided line. So I almost always use backing. Uh, the other rods that I'll throw braided line on are my frog rods, as well as sometimes occasionally topwater baits if I'm really trying to make a longer cast. So maybe I've got schooling fish or I'm fishing cane piles and I really want to whip a long rod out. I'll throw braided line as a main line, but I'll still use a leader in those instances. Other than that, I'll use it for really heavy flipping and punching. So if I'm flipping grass, I for sure will be throwing braided line if it's thick grass that I'm trying to punch through, or milfoil or hydrilla. And again, I like that X5 because it's coarser and cuts through the grass better. Um, I try not to use braided line if I'm flipping around wood, if I can get away with it. So if the wood is not so thick or I'm not flipping into heavy bushes, I don't like to go with braid because braid has a tendency to saw into the wood, which then means you're going to get stuck more. If I'm throwing a heavier fluorocarbon, I generally won't have that same sawing attributes, so I don't get stuck as much in the wood. So it's something to keep in mind. But there's a lot of times you just can't avoid using braid around wood because the wood is so thick, you need that braided line. So that's really when I throw braid. I'm not a huge braid user when it comes to moving baits. I don't throw it on swim jigs, don't throw it on chatterbaits, don't like it on lipless crankbaits. I know that's what a lot of people like braided lines for, but I'm not that way. I don't use it. I think I sacrifice number of bites by using straight braid versus a fluorocarbon or monofilament. So if I move to monofilament, mono is one that I'm very specific with what I use it for. Primarily at this point for me, it's a topwater bait line. The monofilament floats, therefore it doesn't pull the topwater baits down. Topwater baits have better action. So generally speaking, I'm throwing monofilament always on my topwaters. Can occasionally, like I said, with braided line, I may throw a braid top water on braided line. But in those instances, I'm going to use a monofilament leader. So I'll have like a probably usually I'd say 3 to 4 foot leader of monofilament from my braid to the top water. And the whole point there is it keeps the hooks from the top water getting caught up with the braided line because the braided line is softer and tends to catch the hooks when you cast it. And at the same time, that monofilament will float on the surface and keep the top water working in good manner. So I will throw a monofilament leader for top waters if I am throwing the top water on a braided main line. The only other technique that I really throw monofilament with is some crankbaits. I do like to throw some crankbaits on monofilament. It's not a must, but I'm comfortable doing it. Generally speaking, when I do it, I'm going to be using more of like a square bill and fishing shallower cranks because I'm not trying to maximize my depth. It really just comes down to I'm beating it around cover. And a lot of times it's generally when I'm making shorter casts because I want that additional stretch from the monofilament to prevent me from pulling the bait away. If I'm using a crankbait where I'm making long casts and I'm trying to maximize diving depth, I generally go with fluorocarbon. And that leads me into fluorocarbon. So fluorocarbon, being that it's a sinking line, that's something that generally I think helps your bait presentation because it keeps your baits down. At the same time, fluorocarbon's kind of that good mix between braid and monofilament when it comes to line stretch. It's got less line stretch than monofilament, not as less line stretch than monofilament, but it's not as stiff, say, as braid. But it has that characteristic of being clear in the water, so the fish don't see it. Which, with respect to braid, they can see braided line, or it's not as invisible, I guess, is how you'd say it. So fluorocarbon is kind of my primary line that I use. If we're talking spinning gear again, I almost always have a leader of fluorocarbon tied to my braided main line. My leader length I'm going to choose based on the depth that I'm fishing. Generally speaking, I don't ever go with less than 10 feet, but if I'm fishing 10 to 20 feet of water, then I'll match my leader length to the depth that I'm fishing. And if I'm fishing deeper than 20 feet, I stick with a 20-foot leader. Um, I do on spinning gear, I do fish straight fluorocarbon on my jerk baits because again, remember, I'm a jerk bait guy on spinning gear, which I know goes against the norm, but I do like straight fluorocarbon for my jerk baits, and I do like straight fluorocarbon as well for throwing small swim baits on spinning gear. When it comes to bait casting gear, pretty much everything is going to be on fluorocarbon. 15-pound fluorocarbon is like my mainstay. So if we're talking a swim jig, a chatterbait, lipless, still some cranks, spinner baits, Texas rigs, anything along those lines, I'm going to be throwing it on fluorocarbon. It just seems like that is the best all-around line for me. So the majority of my bait casting reels are going to be rigged up with fluorocarbon. I love to flip with it. I love the crank winding baits with it. It just seems like it's the best bait for how I like to fish. So fluorocarbon is definitely a mainstay. I don't like to use braided backing or braided main lines on the majority of my bait casters with a fluorocarbon leader. I just feel like that's not necessary. For me, I think it adds a couple of potential areas that can create issues, whether you're talking knot strength or just, breaking points, but I just don't feel like that's an issue for me. And I don't feel like with heavier fluorocarbon lines, I'm gaining much by going with a braided main line to a fluorocarbon leader. Just my personal preference. It doesn't mean if you do it differently that that's wrong. I'm just simply going over how my setups are and why I like what I do and why I think it works for me. But by all means, guys, when you're talking about fishing lines, like pretty much everything else in fishing, stick with what gives you the most confidence. If you feel comfortable fishing braid with chatterbaits, then go for it. Like I get it, I understand it. I just don't feel as comfortable doing that. I think I'm a better chatterbait fisherman on fluorocarbon. So that's just my personal take on it. If you got questions, guys, let me know in the comments. I generally try to answer every comment that's put up. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow for you.